She had 40 seconds. The monitor screamed flatline at 11:47 p.m., and every nurse on the floor froze. Not from incompetence, but from the particular paralysis that comes when protocol and instinct pull in opposite directions. The man on the bed was unidentified, unconscious, 60-something, found slumped behind a bus shelter on Mercer Street with no wallet, no phone, no name. The ER had cataloged him as John Doe, 7, and assigned him a standard cardiac workup. Emily Carter saw something different. She saw the rash pattern along his left forearm, faint, almost invisible under the fluorescent wash of Bay Hollows Medical Center's trauma bay. She saw the slight blue tinge at the nail beds that didn't match a pure cardiac event. She saw the medication cart beside the bed, where a resident had already drawn up the standard epinephrine protocol, and her stomach dropped like a stone through ice water. She had 30 seconds now. "Don't push that," she said. The resident, a second-year named Marcus Webb, looked up with the particular expression of someone who had been questioned by a person they'd already decided didn't matter. "Excuse me? That epi will kill him. He's having an anaphylactic reaction layered on top of the arrhythmia. His system is already flooded. Epinephrine will send him into irreversible VFib." Emily moved to the crash cart. "He needs diphenhydramine and low-dose glucagon right now, and then we defib." "You're a floor nurse," Webb said. "This is a cardiac event, and I'm the—" "You have 20 seconds to decide if you want to listen to me. Trust. If you're new here, welcome. Follow this channel so you don't miss what happens next. If this story keeps you watching, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get back to Emily Carter and the decision that was about to change everything. Bay Hollows Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Fairmont, Ohio. Not the glamorous part of Ohio that ended up in travel magazines, but the real part. The part with a rusting overpass and a dollar store beside a family-owned pharmacy that had been there since 1987. The hospital was mid-sized, underfunded in the ways that mattered, and overmanaged in the ways that didn't. It had 3 floors of patient rooms, a cardiac unit that the board was quietly proud of, and a culture that operated on a hierarchy so rigid it might as well have been bolted into the floor. Emily had been a nurse there for 8 months. Before that, she'd spent 6 years in the U.S. Army, most of it as a combat medic attached to a forward surgical team that operated in places where the nearest backup was a 40-minute helicopter ride in ideal conditions, and ideal conditions were rare. She'd kept IVs running in the back of moving vehicles. She'd packed wounds with her bare hands while someone was shooting at her. She'd made the kind of decisions that don't appear in nursing school curricula because nursing school curricula assume you are not currently being shot at. She didn't talk about any of that. Not because she was ashamed of it, she wasn't, but because she'd learned quickly that the military background made people in civilian medicine either overly impressed or quietly threatened, and neither reaction was useful. She just wanted to do the work. The work at Bay Hollows was harder than it looked. Not physically. She could handle the physical demands without breaking a sweat. It was the other stuff. The way the senior attending physicians talked to nurses like they were furniture. The way incident reports disappeared into administrative folders. The way a young woman with a calm voice and no MD after her name got evaluated on her deference rather than her judgment. She'd been adapting, biting her tongue more than she liked, picking her battles. Tonight, she stopped picking. She drew the diphenhydramine herself, confirmed the dose, administered it, and called for the defibrillator in the same motion. Not frantic, not slow, but with the particular economy of someone who'd done something similar in conditions far worse than this. Webb stood back, jaw tight, watching. The monitor spiked, stuttered, and then, at the 42-second mark, it found a rhythm. The man on the bed exhaled, a long, ragged sound, but a sound. Emily stepped back and let herself breathe. That was when Dr. Victor Kane walked in. Kane was 54, chief of cardiology, and built like someone who'd played football 20 years ago and was still dining out on it. He had silver at his temples and the kind of institutional confidence that comes from 3 decades of never being wrong, or at least never being told you were wrong, which wasn't the same thing, but felt identical from the inside. He looked at the monitor, looked at the medication log that Webb was already, nervously, filling out. Looked at Emily. "What happened here?" Anaphylactic reaction compounding the arrhythmia, Emily said. Epinephrine would have induced refractory VFib. I administered diphenhydramine and glucagon, then defibrillated. He's stabilized. Kane's expression didn't change for a long moment. Then, who authorized the med change? There wasn't time to get authorization. There is always time to get authorization. He had a 40-second window, maybe less. That is not your call to make. Kane's voice was flat and hard, the kind of flat that's worse than shouting. You are a floor nurse. You are not a physician. You do not alter a medication protocol because you have a feeling. It wasn't a feeling, the rash pattern, the nail bed coloration, I don't want to hear your reasoning. He turned to Webb. Get Dr. Simmons to review this patient. Full workup. Then back to Emily. My office. Now. She followed him down the corridor, and she already knew, somewhere in her chest, that this wasn't a conversation about the patient anymore. Kane's office was this kind of office that announced itself. Framed diplomas, a shelf of cardiology journals, a desk that was slightly too large for the room. He sat behind it. He didn't offer her a chair. You want to explain to me what you think you did tonight? I saved a patient's life. You deviated from established protocol, administered medications without physician authorization, and overrode a second-year resident's clinical judgment. Webb was about to push epinephrine into a patient who would have coded within 30 seconds of receiving it. Webb is a physician. You are not. No, Emily said. I'm a nurse with 6 years of combat medicine experience who recognized a presentation that Webb hadn't seen before. The outcome, Kane said, cutting her off, is irrelevant. We do not run this hospital on cowboy medicine. We run it on protocol, on chain of command, on the understanding that every member of this staff operates within their designated scope. He leaned forward slightly. You've been a problem since you got here, Carter. Too confident, too independent. You don't defer, you don't ask. You just act like your instincts are superior to everyone else's judgment. Emily looked at him. Were they wrong tonight? Something moved behind his eyes. Irritation, maybe, or something closer to embarrassment. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full disciplinary review. Because the patient is alive. Because you broke protocol. He stood. Turn in your badge to the charge desk. Security will escort you out. Emily didn't move for a moment. She'd had commanding officers she disagreed with. She'd had arguments in the field where rank overruled sense, and she'd had to watch the consequences. She knew this feeling, the particular helplessness of being right and powerless simultaneously. I'd rather lose this job, she said, than lose that patient. Kane's jaw tightened. That's a very noble thing to say. Unfortunately for you, you may end up with both. She turned in her badge at 12:23 a.m. The charge nurse, a woman named Donna Briggs, who'd worked the floor for 19 years and had seen enough to know when something was wrong, quietly squeezed Emily's arm as she handed over the lanyard. I saw what you did in there, Donna said, low enough that no one else could hear. That was the right call. Tell the review board that, Emily said. Donna's expression said what her words didn't. Review boards don't work that way. Security walked her to the locker room, waited outside while she changed out of her scrubs, and then walked her to the exit with the particular studied neutrality of people doing an uncomfortable job. Emily didn't argue. She kept her chin level, her expression even, and she thought about the man in Trauma Bay 3 whose chest was rising and falling in steady, living rhythm. And she held on to that. The night air outside was cold, February in Fairmont, which meant genuinely bitter. And Emily stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her bag over her shoulder and nowhere immediately to go. Her car was in the staff lot. She'd have to walk around the building. Small logistics, manageable. Her phone buzzed. A text from her younger brother, Danny, who lived in Columbus and had a habit of texting at odd hours. You still at work? Mom wants to know if you're coming for her birthday weekend. She stared at the screen for a second, then typed back, Yeah, I'll be there. She started walking. By morning, it was worse than she'd expected. The formal complaint had been filed while she was sleeping. She'd gotten 3 hours, which was closer to normal than it should have been. And it wasn't just a suspension notice. Dr. Kane, with the support of hospital administration, had filed a report with the Ohio Board of Nursing citing unauthorized medication administration, disregard for clinical hierarchy, and conduct unbecoming a licensed medical professional. There was language in the report about reckless endangerment that made Emily read the paragraph twice to confirm she'd understood it correctly. She was being accused of endangering the patient she'd saved. She sat at the kitchen table in her apartment, second floor of a building on Caldwell Street, small, functional, with a window that looked out on the parking lot of a dry cleaner. And she read the document twice and then set her phone face down on the table and made herself breathe. She called a lawyer. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who handled medical licensing cases, listened to the full account and then made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite a curse. "They're going fast on this," Okafor said. "The board filing the same night is unusual. It suggests someone wants to get ahead of a counter-narrative." "There's no counter-narrative. The patient is alive because of what I did." "That's your narrative. Theirs is that a nurse circumvented physician authority and got lucky." A pause. "Do you have documentation? Anything you recorded yourself at the time?" "No, there wasn't time." "Then we're dealing with your word against a chief of cardiology and a hospital administration." Emily knew how that math worked. She'd been in the Army long enough to understand institutional self-protection. "What are my options?" "Fight the board complaint, which takes months and costs money and may not go your way regardless. Or try to access the hospital's own records, security footage, medication logs, the monitor readings, which could support your account but which Bay Hollows has zero incentive to share. And the patient? If he recovers, his case file, he's a John Doe. No next of kin on file, no identity confirmed. His records belong to the hospital." Emily closed her eyes for a moment. "All right," she said. "Let's figure out what we can do." Well, she went back to the hospital that afternoon. Not through the main entrance. She'd been formally suspended and her badge access was revoked, but through the visitor's entrance without the scrubs and civilian clothes, to sit in the public waiting area and think. It was a habit from her Army days. When you were stuck, you went back to the terrain and looked at it differently. The cardiac unit was on the second floor. John Doe 7 would still be there, assuming he was stable. She wasn't going to try to access his room. That would confirm everything Kane was accusing her of. But she wanted to be in the building, wanted to understand the geometry of what was happening. She was sitting with a cup of vending machine coffee when she noticed the two men. They were in the lobby, near the information desk. Civilian clothes. Good civilian clothes. The kind that were designed to look ordinary and mostly succeeded, but had a particular tailored quality that Emily recognized. Posture was wrong for civilians too. Too still. Heads doing that constant low-level environmental scan that you either had or you didn't, and you got it from spending time in places where not scanning got you killed. Federal agents. Not local law enforcement. Their shoes were wrong for that, and there was no departmental tell anywhere on them. Something federal, something with resources. They were talking to the information desk administrator and showing something. A credential, maybe a photograph. Emily watched them over the rim of her coffee cup. She couldn't hear the conversation from across the lobby. The administrator looked at the credential, looked at her computer, made a phone call. The two men waited with the patience of people who expected to get what they came for. Then a third man came through the main entrance and Emily felt something tighten in her chest. He wasn't in civilian clothes. He was in the dress uniform of a U.S. Army colonel, and he had the kind of bearing that didn't require rank insignia to communicate. He met the two federal agents at the desk, exchanged 3 words, and then the 3 of them moved together toward the elevators, toward the second floor, with the coordinated efficiency of people who had a specific destination and were moving there directly. The second floor was the cardiac unit. Emily sat very still for a moment. Then she stood, threw away the coffee cup, and found a spot near the elevator bank where she could watch the second floor indicator without being in anyone's direct sight line. The elevator went up. The indicator stayed on 2 for 4 minutes. Then additional movement. She heard the exterior doors and looked back toward the entrance. 4 more people. 2 in suits, 2 in military dress. One of the suited figures had the particular air of authority over authority, The kind Emily had only ever seen around people who were protecting someone so important that the people around them were themselves important. Secret Service. She recognized the earpieces a second later, and the recognition landed like cold water. Bay Hollow's Medical Center's lobby was now, quietly and efficiently, being occupied by what appeared to be a significant federal security detail. And nobody in the lobby seemed to fully understand what they were looking at yet. The nurses at the information desk were exchanging glances. A man waiting with his wife for discharge paperwork was frowning at his phone, distracted. The security guard at the main desk had straightened up in the particular way of someone who'd been told something important was happening without being told what. Emily didn't move. She thought about the man in Trauma Bay 3, the unidentified man with no wallet, no phone, no name, the man with the rash along his forearm that nobody else had caught, the man who would have died from an epinephrine bolus that was, as of 11:47 last night, the official protocol-approved treatment being prepared for him. She thought about the way the federal agents had headed directly, without hesitation, to the cardiac unit. She thought about the colonel. And then, because she'd spent 6 years training to read a situation and act before she fully understood it, she moved to a seat that was slightly farther from the elevator bank, slightly closer to a secondary exit, and she waited. Whatever was coming through those doors had not finished arriving. The hospital administrator, a man named Gerald Tharp, who wore his authority like a second suit jacket, appeared from the stairwell at 3:17 p.m. with the expression of someone who had just been told something that rearranged his understanding of the afternoon. He had his phone pressed to his ear, and he was walking too fast for a man of his build, which meant he was frightened. A junior administrator, Emily recognized her, a woman named Lisa Ewan, who'd processed Emily's onboarding paperwork 8 months ago, fell into step beside Tharp and said something Emily couldn't hear. Tharp said something back. Lisa's eyes went wide. Then Tharp looked up from his phone scan and his gaze traveled across the lobby. Checking, inventorying, the way people do when they suddenly realize their building has become someone else's jurisdiction. And for a half second, he looked directly at Emily. His expression flickered. Recognition. Then something else. Surprise, maybe, or alarm. And then his face went deliberately neutral, and he looked away and kept walking. Emily watched him go. He knew who she was. He'd signed off on her suspension notice this morning. And he'd just seen her in the lobby of the hospital he'd kicked her out of, while federal agents were occupying the second floor, and whatever he was thinking, he hadn't called security to remove her. That told her something. She didn't know exactly what it told her yet, but she'd spent enough time in rooms where information was the real currency to understand that the fact of her presence here had just entered the calculus of whatever was happening above her head. Her phone buzzed. A call from Patricia Okafor, her lawyer. She stepped toward the secondary exit, pushed through into the cold stairwell, and answered. Patricia. Emily. A pause that had weight to it. I've been getting some interesting calls in the last hour. I don't want to get ahead of things, but I need to ask you something directly. Do you know who that patient was? John Doe 7. That's all I was ever told. Another pause. Longer. Emily, Okafor said, you need to stay wherever you are right now. Don't leave that hospital. The line went dead. Emily stood in the stairwell with the phone in her hand and listened to the building around her, the distant PA system, the hum of ventilation, the sound of boots on the floor above her head, moving with purpose. She pressed her back against the cold cinder block wall, and she waited. And she did not know yet what she had walked into, but she knew with the certainty of someone who had learned to read a battlefield that the ground beneath this hospital had just shifted, and that everything was about to change. The call had lasted 11 seconds. Emily stared at her phone screen after Okafor hung up. The kind of stare that wasn't really seeing the screen, was seen past it to the 11 seconds of implication coiled inside those few words. Do you know who that patient was? Not is, was. Past tense, like the man's identity had already been confirmed somewhere by someone, and the information was moving faster than Emily could track. She stayed in the stairwell. The concrete was cold through her jacket, and the ventilation above her head made a sound like breathing. She counted the noises of the building. Footsteps above, a door opening and closing on the first floor below, the distant roll of a cart on linoleum. and she ran the math on what she knew. An unidentified man. No wallet, no phone. Found on Mercer Street. Mid-60s, physically fit beneath the surface presentation of someone who'd been living rough. She'd clocked that in the trauma bay and filed it without knowing why it mattered. The rash pattern, the specific allergy interaction, a man who didn't carry identification and didn't have anyone waiting for him, or at least no one who'd made themselves known to Bay Hollow's administration. Until now. A colonel and Secret Service agents don't mobilize for a homeless man. They don't mobilize for a retired accountant or a former teacher or a local businessman whose family recognized a news photo. The scale of what was happening upstairs required a kind of importance that had its own gravitational field, and Emily was standing in the pull of it without a clear picture of the center. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Okafor this time. Stay visible. Don't approach anyone official. Just be there. Emily read it twice. Stay visible was interesting advice for someone who'd just been formally removed from the premises. It implied Okafor thought visibility was now an asset rather than a liability, which implied the calculation had changed, which implied whoever was upstairs already knew something about what had happened last night. She pushed open the stairwell door and walked back into the lobby. The lobby had changed in the 10 minutes she'd been in the stairwell. There were now 2 uniformed officers, Fairmont PD, not federal, standing near the main entrance with the particular expression of local law enforcement who've been told to be present and deferential, which was not an expression most local law enforcement were comfortable wearing. A cluster of hospital staff near the admissions desk were doing the thing people do when something significant is happening nearby and they don't know what it is. Phones out, voices low, eyes tracking toward the elevators every 30 seconds. Emily took a seat near the window. She had a clear sight line to the elevator bank and the stairwell entrance and the main door. Old habit. She'd spent a lot of time in unfamiliar rooms figuring out where to sit. She was there for 20 minutes before the elevator opened and things accelerated. The first person out was a Secret Service agent she hadn't seen before. Female, early 40s, expression like a closed door. Behind her, 2 men in suits Emily didn't recognize. And behind them, a figure who walked with the kind of controlled urgency that tries to look like calm and doesn't quite manage it. Gerald Tharp, the hospital administrator, his face doing something complicated between professional composure and what Emily identified as low-grade terror. Beside Tharp was Dr. Victor Kane. Kane looked different from this morning. This morning he'd been authoritative, dismissive, fully in command of his own territory. Now he looked like a man who'd been handed information he didn't want and was still deciding how to carry it. His jaw was set too hard. His hands were moving, small gestures, adjustments, the kind of movement that happens when a person is physically suppressing the urge to do something with their hands. They didn't see Emily immediately. They were talking, low, fast, heads angled toward each other, and moving toward the administrator's corridor. Then Tharp glanced up and saw her. He stopped walking. Kane, following Tharp's sightline, stopped a beat later. The 3 of them held that for a moment. Emily seated by the window, Kane and Tharp standing 12 feet away, the lobby doing its normal business around them, as if the air hadn't just pulled tight. Kane's expression went through something Emily couldn't fully read. It started as irritation, she could see that clearly, and moved somewhere more complicated. Something that might have been recalculation. Tharp said something to Kane without looking away from Emily. Kane said something back. Then Tharp straightened up and walked toward her. Emily didn't stand. "Ms. Carter," Tharp said. He stopped at a distance that was formal rather than confrontational, 2 feet farther back than a normal conversation would require. "I wasn't aware you were still on the premises." "I haven't been notified that I'm required to leave," Emily said. "My suspension pertains to my employment status, not my access as a member of the public." Technically true. She'd checked before coming back. Tharp's mouth pressed together briefly. "There's a situation developing that involves last night's events. Someone from federal law enforcement will want to speak with you." "I'll cooperate fully," Emily said. "Yes." He looked at her for another second, and she had the distinct impression he was trying to figure out what she knew and had concluded correctly that she wasn't going to tell him. "Stay available, please." He walked back. Kane had already turned away. "Yeah, The federal agent who found her 40 minutes later was a woman named Special Agent Diane Rourke, Department of Homeland Security, with credentials that Emily verified carefully and a handshake that was more direct than most. She was somewhere in her late 30s, brown hair pulled back practically, and she had the focused economy of someone who did not have time to perform authority because she didn't need to. They sat in a small meeting room off the main corridor. No one else came in. Rourke set a digital recorder on the table, asked Emily's permission, got it, and then said, "Walk me through last night. Everything, from the beginning. Take your time." Emily didn't take her time, Ja. She was precise and chronological, the way her army training had made her in debriefs, stripping out the subjective and leading with the observable. The rash pattern, the nail bed coloration, the prepared epinephrine, the timeline, the decision, the outcome. Kane's response, the suspension. Rourke listened without interrupting, which Emily appreciated. She made occasional notes. When Emily finished, she asked 3 follow-up questions, all clinical, all specific, none of them the kind of question that was actually about something else. And then she sat back. "How long were you a combat medic?" Rourke asked. 6 years, 2 deployments, 1 with a forward surgical unit. That's where you learned to read the allergy presentation? We saw it twice in the field. Anaphylaxis misread as cardiac. You push the epi and you lose them. Emily kept her voice level. I recognized the pattern. I made a call. Rourke nodded slowly. "Ms. Carter, I want to be direct with you. The man you treated last night has been identified. I'm not in a position to give you his full identity yet, but I can tell you that the medical decision you made last night is now the subject of significant federal attention, and that attention is not directed at you." A pause, deliberate and precise. "The complaint filed against you this morning is also going to receive attention." Emily absorbed that. What kind of attention? The kind that comes with a federal review of all documentation pertaining to last night's events, including communication records, medication logs, and nursing board submissions. Rourke's expression didn't shift, but something in it said, "You understand what that means." Emily understood. If federal investigators were pulling documentation, Kane's complaint to the nursing board, filed within hours of the incident, unusually fast, unusually aggressive, would be examined in the context of everything else. In the context of what Kane had done, or hadn't done, in the time before Emily arrived in that trauma bay. He ignored the emergency calls, Emily said. It wasn't a question. Rourke looked at her. I can't confirm details of an ongoing review. You just confirmed it, Emily said. Rourke allowed herself something that wasn't quite a smile. We'll need a formal statement on record, longer than what you've given me today. Full chronological account, everything you observed. She stood. We'll also need your contact information and your availability for the next 72 hours. Don't make plans to leave Fairmont. I haven't, Emily said. Well, she called Okafor from the parking lot, standing beside her car in the February cold, breath fogging. Homeland Security, Okafor said when Emily finished. That's significant. That means whoever the patient is, there's a national security dimension to his protection. A pause. Emily, I'm going to be honest with you. This is moving in a direction I didn't anticipate this morning, and I think it's moving in your favor, but I've been wrong before, and I want you to be careful. Careful how? Don't talk to Kane. Don't talk to Tharp. Don't talk to anyone at that hospital without me present. If they call you, you call me first. Another pause. And I know this is going to sound strange. Don't be too available. Let them come to you. You've done nothing wrong and you have nothing to prove. Act like it. Emily thought about that. You think there's still a chance they try to make the board complaint stick? Kane filed it fast and loud. He put it on record before anyone could reframe the narrative. Men like Kane don't back away from things like that easily. It costs them too much face. So yes, I think there's still a play being made, even with federal agents in the building. Okafor's voice was careful, lawyerly, precise. Just don't hand them anything they can use. Emily said she understood and got off the call. She sat in the car for a moment before starting it. The hospital's exterior was in front of her. Brick and glass, The familiar logo on the sign by the entrance, the ambulance bay to the right. She'd walked through that entrance 8 months ago with her certifications and her discharge papers and the quiet intention of building something here, something quieter than what she'd come from. She started the car. The nursing board notification arrived at 6:44 p.m. Emily was at her kitchen table with a bowl of soup she was mostly ignoring when her email loaded the formal notice. A temporary suspension of her nursing license pending investigation, effective immediately, with a hearing date set for 31 days out. Standard procedure, the document said. Standard procedure. As if a license suspension was something that just happened between two reasonable parties who disagreed about a technicality. She forwarded it to Okafor without commentary. Okafor's response came in 4 minutes. I saw. On it. Don't respond to anything from the board directly. Emily set the phone down and ate 3 more spoons of soup and looked at the wall. The apartment was quiet. Her neighbor's television was a low murmur through the wall to the left, and outside the window the dry cleaner's parking lot was half lit by a security lamp that buzzed slightly in the cold. She'd lived here for 7 months. She still hadn't put anything on the walls. She'd kept telling herself she'd get to it. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, then picked up on the 3rd ring because Okafor had said stay available. Ms. Carter. Male voice, measured, carrying the particular flatness of someone who'd spent years speaking to people in high-stress situations and had learned to keep their own voice a neutral instrument. This is Captain Richard Toll, White House Medical Unit. I'm calling to inform you that we have reviewed the medical records pertaining to last night's incident, including the real-time monitor data, the medication cart timestamp logs, and the emergency call records on file with Bay Hollows Medical Center. Emily said nothing. I'm calling to tell you, Toll continued, that the review is complete and that the findings are unambiguous. What you did last night was correct, and what you did was fast enough to matter. A short pause. The patient is stable. I'm glad, Emily said. And she meant it straightforwardly, without performance. There's going to be a meeting tomorrow morning. We'd like you present. I'm not in a position to tell you more than that tonight. Another pause, and then something shifted slightly in his voice, not informal, but less official. Get some sleep, Ms. Carter. I mean that genuinely. He ended the call. Emily put the phone down on the table and stared at it. Then she picked up her soup and finished it, because she was hungry, and it was going cold and there was nothing she could do tonight that sleep wouldn't make easier. She was wrong about the sleep. She got maybe 90 minutes. At 4:12 a.m., her phone lit up with a text from Donna Briggs, the charge nurse who'd squeezed her arm on the way out 2 nights ago. Donna wasn't supposed to contact suspended staff. She'd done it anyway, which said something about Donna. The text was 6 words. Kane knew before you got there. Emily sat up in bed and read it twice. Then she typed, "What do you mean?" Donna's reply took 4 minutes, which meant she was being careful about what she put in writing. Emergency alert at 11:31. He was paged. Logs show he signed off on the page. Never called back. Never came down. You showed up at 11:43. Emily did the math. The emergency alert had gone out 12 minutes before she walked into that trauma bay. Kane had been paged. Kane had acknowledged the page. And Kane had not responded. The man on that table had been in crisis for 12 minutes before Emily arrived, and the physician who was supposed to come had seen the alert and decided not to. And then, when Emily made the call that Kane should have been there to make, when she'd done his job and saved the patient he'd ignored, Kane had suspended her for it. She sat in the dark of her bedroom and held that for a long moment. Not with anger exactly. Anger came and went too fast to be useful. Something more like clarity, cold and still and completely solid. She forwarded Donna's text to Okafor. Then she added one line of her own. It wasn't about protocol. It never was. Outside her window, Fairmont was dark and quiet and a long way from morning. But somewhere across the city, in a room on the 2nd floor of Bay Hollows Medical Center, federal investigators were going through 12 months of communication logs, and somewhere in those logs was a page acknowledgement with Kane's ID attached to it, and a gap of 12 minutes that had no innocent explanation. The meeting was in 6 hours. Emily lay back down, closed her eyes, and did not sleep. The meeting was in the hospital's third-floor conference room, which was normally used for department heads and quarterly reviews and the kind of administrative gatherings that required a projector and a whiteboard. Someone had rearranged it overnight. The long table had been cleared of its usual materials and replaced with laptops, external drives, and the particular organized density of a working investigation. When Emily arrived at 9:58 a.m. with Okafor beside her, there were already 8 people in the room, and not one of them worked for Bay Hollow's medical center. She recognized Rourke from yesterday, the colonel she'd seen in the lobby. She had a name for him now, Colonel James Whitfield, Army Surgeon General's office, which Okafor had sourced from a contact at 6 a.m., was seated at the far end of the table with a tablet and a posture that communicated he'd been awake since at least midnight. 2 people she didn't recognize were working laptops with the focused efficiency of people cross-referencing rather than discovering. Captain Toll, the White House medical unit officer who'd called her last night, was standing near the window with a coffee he appeared to have forgotten about. Nobody from Bay Hollow's administration was in the room. That absence told Emily more than most of the presences. Okafor pulled out a chair for Emily and sat beside her without being asked, which was exactly what Emily needed from a lawyer in that moment. Presence without performance. Rourke opened a folder, looked up briefly, and said, "Thank you for coming, Ms. Carter. I know the timeline has been compressed." "I'm here," Emily said, which covered it. Rourke set a photograph on the table and slid it across. It was a formal portrait, the kind taken for official documentation, of a man in his mid-60s. The photograph had been taken some years ago, the subject's hair darker, his face carrying less of the weathering Emily had seen on the table in Trauma Bay 3. But the jaw was the same, the set of the eyes. "Robert Harper," Rourke said, "retired, formerly Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He left federal service 11 years ago." A pause, precisely calibrated. "He is also the father of President Daniel Harper." Emily looked at the photograph and then at Rourke. "He chose to live off the grid," Rourke continued, "completely voluntarily. His identity was classified at his own request. He wanted no security detail, no official presence, no acknowledgement. The president respected that choice." Something moved behind Rourke's expression that might have been the edge of a personal opinion carefully contained. The protocol was that if Robert Harper ever presented to a medical facility, a silent alert would trigger to DHS and the White House Medical Unit. The alert triggered at 11:29 p.m. 2 nights ago when his fingerprints were logged during intake processing. "The emergency page to Dr. Kane went out at 11:31, Emily said. Rourke looked at her steadily. "Yes." "He acknowledged it at 11:31. "Yes." "And didn't come down." "The first documented in-person response from Dr. Kane," Rourke said, "is the timestamp on the Trauma Bay door log. He entered at 11:54, 7 minutes after you'd stabilized the patient." She let that sit for a moment. "The monitor data shows Robert Harper entered critical arrhythmia at approximately 11:39. Your intervention was logged at 11:47. If you had not been in that bay, the 8-minute window," Colonel Whitfield said from the far end of the table. It was the first thing he'd said since Emily walked in, and he said it the way military officers say things they've already fully processed. Flat, final, without decoration. 8 minutes between critical onset and your intervention. With epinephrine administered, he would not have survived to the 12-minute mark. The room was quiet. Emily didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the data hadn't already said more cleanly. Okafor beside her set her pen down on her legal pad with a small, deliberate sound. "The nursing board complaint," Okafor said, her voice precise and controlled, "filed at 2:17 a.m. the same night. I'd like to understand the hospital's current position on that filing." Rourke glanced at one of the laptop operators who pulled up something on screen. "The board has been notified that the filing is under federal review. They've agreed to suspend the review process pending our findings." She looked at Emily. "Ms. Carter, we're going to need your formal statement today, the full account, on record. After that, we need to discuss what happens next." "What does happen next?" Emily asked. Whitfield answered before Rourke could. "The president has been briefed on the full timeline. He has requested to meet the person who saved his father's life. He paused, and the pause felt less like hesitation and more like giving the weight of the sentence room to land. He'll be arriving at Bay Hollows this afternoon. The next 4 hours were the strangest of Emily's life, and she'd once spent 14 hours providing emergency surgical support in a forward position during a communications blackout, while a sandstorm dropped visibility to 3 feet. So her baseline for strange was higher than most people's. Okafor stayed with her. They were given a room, not the conference room, but a smaller one nearby, with water and sandwiches that Emily ate mechanically because she'd learned long ago that you ate when food was available because you didn't know when the next opportunity would be. She gave her formal statement to a DHS recording officer, 2 hours of it, every detail she could pull from the night in question, organized chronologically, with Okafor present and occasionally signaling her to slow down or clarify, but never interrupting the substance. Around noon, they could hear movement in the corridor, more of it than before. The building's acoustic atmosphere had shifted. The sound of additional people, additional equipment, the particular organized bustle that happens when a location is being prepared for something significant. Okafor went out twice to speak with Rourke. Both times she came back with the particular expression of a lawyer who was receiving information that was going well and was disciplining herself against optimism until it was confirmed. The board complaint, Okafor said on the second return, sitting down and folding her hands on the table. Kane personally called the board chair at 1:45 a.m. to push for expedited processing. The board chair has now received a call from the DHS General Counsel's office. She paused. The board chair is reportedly having a difficult morning. Kane called at 1:45, Emily said. Yes. 2 hours after my suspension, while a federal medical team was actively treating the patient. Emily thought about that. He knew who the patient was. Okafor's expression was careful. We don't have confirmation of that. If the fingerprint alert triggered at 11:29 and the hospital system received the emergency page at 11:31, then the intake flag was in the system before Kane was paged. Emily kept her voice level. If he checked the patient file, which he would have before responding to a cardiac emergency, he'd have seen the flag. Okafor looked at her for a moment. That's a significant allegation. It's a logical inference from the documented timeline. It's also, Okafor said quietly, something that federal investigators will have already thought of. She picked up her pen. Let them pull that thread. That's not our job today. Emily nodded. She understood. Her job today was to be exactly what she was, a nurse who had made a correct clinical decision under pressure, and to let the other pieces arrange themselves around that fact. It was the same discipline as staying in your lane on a tactical operation. You controlled your sector. You trusted the broader structure to handle its own. The problem was that Emily had never been entirely good at trusting the broader structure. At 2:40 p.m., Richard Toll knocked on the door and came in without waiting for an answer, which told Emily the timeline had moved. The motorcade is 15 minutes out, he said. He looked at Emily directly. The president's going to see his father first. Then he's asked to meet you. He paused. I want to prepare you for the fact that he has read the full investigative summary. Everything in that summary. He knows what happened in that trauma bay, and he knows what happened after. Okay, Emily said. Toll started, then stopped. He tried again. He doesn't do well with... He's going to want to thank you personally. He may not be entirely composed. That's normal. He's a son who almost lost his father. Just meet him where he is. Emily nodded. She appreciated the warning. People in crisis presented differently than people in authority, and she'd learned that the hard way the first time she'd had to deliver bad news to a family member while still processing the operational adrenaline of the event that produced the bad news. Toll left. Okafor looked at Emily. How are you doing? Fine, Emily said, and meant it as accurately as she could. She wasn't fine in the sense of comfortable. Yet, her nervous system was running hot the way it always did before something significant, but she was functional and clear-headed, and her hands weren't shaking. I'm fine. You don't have to perform anything in there, Okafor said. You don't have to be impressive. You just have to be honest. I know. I'll be outside the door. I know that too, Emily said, and almost managed to smile. She heard the motorcade before she saw it, the specific sound of coordinated vehicle arrival, engines and doors, the movement of people who moved in formation, even in civilian contexts. Through the small room's window, she could see the hospital's main entrance, and she watched the controlled precision of the arrival from a distance. The vehicles, the agents moving to positions, the brief organized pause before the central figure emerged. He was taller than his photographs suggested. Presidents usually were. Or maybe it was just the particular way they carried themselves in person, the specific alignment of someone who had spent years being the fixed point around which rooms organized themselves. Daniel Harper was 51, grayer than his campaign photos, and he was walking with the speed of a man who had somewhere specific to be and needed to get there now, not the performative urgency of politics, the real kind. He went upstairs. Emily waited. 22 minutes passed. She spent them sitting straight in her chair, not looking at her phone, running through the clinical sequence of 2 nights ago one more time, not because she doubted it, but because it was solid ground to stand on. What she'd seen, what she'd decided. Why? Then Toll came back and said, "He's ready." They'd put Robert Harper in a private room at the end of the cardiac unit's corridor, the one normally reserved for patients who required isolation for infectious reasons or privacy for political ones. It had a window facing the hospital's small courtyard, bare trees, winter grass, a concrete path, and someone had brought in a chair that didn't belong to the hospital's standard furniture inventory. Robert Harper was sitting up. He was pale and IV connected and had the slightly unmoored look of someone who'd been unconscious recently and was still recalibrating the sequence of events that had led to this room. But his eyes were sharp. Emily noticed that immediately. The eyes of a man whose body had been through something significant, but whose mind had not lost its edge. The president was standing beside his father's bed, with one hand on the bed rail, and he turned when Emily came in, and his expression was, she'd expected formal or official, or the carefully constructed warmth of someone performing gratitude in front of witnesses. It wasn't any of those things. It was just a person who'd gotten a phone call 2 days ago that had rearranged the entire internal geography of his life, and who was looking at the person who'd made that call unnecessary. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was steady, but only barely. "Mr. President," Emily said. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and extended his hand, and his grip was firm and held a beat longer than a standard handshake. "I've read everything," he said. "The medical reports, the monitor data, the timeline. I understand what you saw and when you saw it and what you did about it." He stopped, started again. "I need you to understand that I'm not thanking you as the president right now. I'm thanking you as his son." Emily looked at him, and she thought about the right thing to say, and she said the true thing instead of the impressive one. "I did what I was trained to do. I'm glad I was there to do it." Harper's jaw moved. He nodded once, sharply, the nod of someone accepting a statement they're not entirely sure they have words for. Then he looked at his father. Robert Harper was watching Emily with an expression that she couldn't immediately categorize. Not gratitude exactly. Something more measured, more analytical. The look of someone assessing. "Sit down," Robert said. His voice was rougher than his son's, worn at the edges, but it carried the particular compressed authority of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where what was said carried real weight. Emily sat in the visitor's chair. "I was told your background," Robert said. "Combat medic. Forward surgical. 2 deployments." "Yes, sir." "Where?" She told him. He nodded, and she had the sense he was doing something with that information rather than just receiving it. "They fired you," he said, "for saving my life." "Suspended," Emily said. "There's a nursing board complaint." "There was," the president said from behind her. "There isn't any more." He paused. "The board has withdrawn the suspension pending review and been advised that the federal investigation has found no basis for the complaint. That became official 40 minutes ago." Emily absorbed that. She'd known it was coming. Okafor's morning signals had pointed in that direction. But hearing it stated flatly, without ceremony, still required a moment of reorientation. "And Kane?" she asked. The president and his father exchanged a look. Something passed between them that had the economy of a conversation they'd already had. Dr. Kane is currently in a meeting with federal investigators, the president said carefully. I'm not going to speak to the specifics of what comes from that, but I can tell you that the evidence regarding his actions and his inactions on the night in question has been fully documented and is being addressed through the appropriate channels. It was the right answer, the official answer. Emily understood why he gave it and didn't push. Robert Harper was still watching her. You had 12 years in the Army and you're working night shifts at a mid-sized hospital in Fairmont, he said. Why? The directness of it was almost refreshing. I wanted something quieter, Emily said. That didn't work out as planned. The old man made a sound that might have been a laugh on a better day. No, he said. I imagine not. But she was in the corridor outside Robert Harper's room, waiting for Okafor and processing the conversation, when she heard the raised voices from around the corner. Not shouting, controlled people in crisis mode rarely shouted, because shouting was an admission that the situation had exceeded your management capacity, and controlled people didn't admit that. But voices elevated past their normal operating volume, which in a federal investigation context meant something had cracked. She moved toward the sound before she'd consciously decided to. Around the corner, in the section of corridor that connected the cardiac unit to the administrative elevator bank, Victor Kane was standing with two federal agents flanking him and Rourke directly in front of him, and his composure, the architectural confidence she'd watched him construct and maintain for 8 months, had developed visible fractures. The log data is being misrepresented, Kane was saying. An acknowledged page means I saw the notification. It does not mean I had confirmed the acuity. Dr. Kane. Rourke's voice was flat and very calm. The log shows you acknowledged the page at 11:31. The patient's monitor data, transmitted in real time to the nursing station, shows critical arrhythmia onset at 11:39. The system timestamps are continuous and unbroken. You had access to that data from the moment you acknowledged the page. I was managing 2 other cases. Your location data from your badge scan shows you were in the physician's lounge from 11:28 to 11:53. Rourke held eye contact. That's the physician's lounge, not an active patient bay. Silence. Kane saw Emily at the end of the corridor. His expression changed, not to guilt, not to shame, but to something harder and more dangerous. The look of a man who has decided that the problem in front of him is a problem of enemies rather than a problem of his own making. She had no authorization, Kane said. His voice had dropped into something cold and controlled. Whatever the outcome, she violated protocol. That is a legal and professional fact. The outcome, Rourke said, is that Robert Harper is alive. The alternative outcome, given the documented timeline of your response, would have been the death of the president's father in your hospital while you were in the physician's lounge. She let a beat pass. I'd encourage you to speak with your attorney before continuing this conversation. Kane looked at Emily for 3 more seconds. She didn't look away, didn't respond, gave him nothing to work with. Then he turned back to Rourke and said, with the last available fragments of his professional bearing, I have nothing further to say at this time. I know, Rourke said. That's a good decision. Okafor was waiting for Emily at the elevator. I heard the end of that, Okafor said quietly. The badge scan puts him in the lounge, Emily said. I know. Rourke told me 15 minutes ago. Okafor pressed the elevator button. Emily, there's something else. Something that came up in the last hour that you need to know. She paused, and the pause had a different quality than her usual precision. This one had an edge of something that Emily identified, after a moment, as controlled discomfort. Tell me, Emily said. The nursing board chair, Okafor said. The one Kane called at 1:45 a.m. Federal investigators pulled his phone records as part of the broader document seizure. She stopped. Emily waited. Kane called him, Okafor said, but the board chair also called the hospital's legal counsel at 2:03 a.m., and the hospital's legal counsel called Gerald Tharp at 2:11. She looked at Emily steadily. Tharp then made a call to an Ohio State health licensing official at 2:29 a.m. The investigators believed they were trying to accelerate the board process far enough that even if the federal investigation went in your favor, The state-level disciplinary action would already be far enough along to be difficult to reverse. The elevator arrived. They stepped in. Emily looked at the closing doors and felt something settle in her chest. The particular cold clarity that came when a situation stopped being ambiguous and became entirely, precisely visible. It hadn't just been Kane protecting himself. It had been coordinated. Multiple people, in the middle of the night, working the administrative and legal machinery as fast as they could to make sure that whatever the federal investigators found, there would be parallel tracks of disciplinary consequence that were harder to undo. They'd tried to bury her twice, once in real time and once in the hours after, while she was asleep in her apartment eating soup and thinking about wall decorations. "How exposed are they?" Emily asked. Phone records showing coordinated nighttime communication aimed at accelerating a disciplinary action against someone whose actions were simultaneously being reviewed by federal investigators? Okafor let that sentence sit. Very. The elevator stopped on the first floor. "There's one more thing," Okafor said, and her voice had shifted, past the lawyerly caution, into something more direct. "Whitfield asked me, on behalf of the White House Medical Unit, whether you would be willing to meet with a senior official tomorrow morning. Not the president, a separate meeting with a different purpose." She looked at Emily. "He said to tell you it was about what comes next. For you." Emily stepped out of the elevator into the lobby. Bay Hollow's Medical Center's lobby, where she'd sat 2 days ago with a cup of bad vending machine coffee, watching federal agents move through her hospital, not yet knowing what she was watching. "Tell him yes," Emily said. She was halfway across the lobby toward the main exit when her phone rang. Okafor was still behind her, and Emily checked the screen. Unknown number, but the area code was Washington, D.C. She answered. "Ms. Carter?" A woman's voice, professional and crisp. "I'm calling from the White House counsel's office. Are you in a location where you can speak?" "Yes," Emily said. "We've just received confirmation from the Ohio Attorney General's office that they've been contacted by federal investigators regarding potential obstruction of a state professional licensing process." A pause. "Gerald Tharp has retained private counsel in the last 40 minutes. Dr. Kane's attorney has contacted our office to inquire about the scope of the investigation. The hospital's board of directors has called an emergency meeting." Another pause, shorter. "I'm calling to inform you, as a courtesy, that the Department of Justice has requested full access to Bay Hollow's Medical Center's administrative communication records going back 18 months. Emily stopped walking. Around her, the lobby continued its business. A family by the information desk, a maintenance worker with a cart, the low PA system calling a name she didn't recognize. 18 months? She said. Yes. The woman on the other end let the silence sit for exactly the right length of time. Preliminary review of those records suggests that what happened 2 nights ago may not have been the first time Dr. Kane failed to respond to a critical emergency page. A pause. And then, with careful precision, it appears to have been the first time the consequences were impossible to manage. Emily stood very still in the middle of the lobby and understood, with the full weight of that understanding arriving all at once, that this was not going to be a story about one night and one patient and one wrong call. 18 months of records, 18 months of pages and timestamps and badge scan data and whatever else lived in those administrative logs. 18 months of a system that had been managing its mistakes internally, quietly, and presenting a clean face to the outside. And somewhere in Bay Hollow's Medical Center's server room, those 18 months were now in the hands of people who had no incentive to keep them quiet. She thought about Donna Briggs's text at 4 a.m. Kane knew before you got there. She thought about the charge nurses and the floor staff and the junior residents who'd been navigating Kane's territory for years, watching things happen and logging them somewhere in their private accounting of what this place was and what it wasn't. She thought about how many other patients there might have been, how many other windows. "Ms. Carter?" the woman from the counsel's office said. "I'm here," Emily said. "I wanted you to know," the woman said, "because you were the one who forced this into the open. Whatever comes from those records, and our preliminary assessment is that there will be significant findings, it comes from the fact that you made a decision 2 nights ago that couldn't be explained away." A pause. You should know that. The call ended. Emily put the phone in her pocket and looked at the main entrance. The glass doors, the winter light beyond them, the ambulance bay to the right where the ordinary business of medicine and emergency and human urgency continued without pause. Behind her, Okafor had caught up and was reading her expression. What was that? 18 months, Emily said. Okafor went very still. They're pulling 18 months of records, Emily said, and they think Kane's been doing this for a while. Okafor said nothing for a moment, then, how many? They don't know yet. Emily looked at her. But enough to matter. She pushed through the glass doors into the February cold, and the wind hit her face, and across the parking lot the bare trees moved against a pale sky. Fairmont, Ohio. The hospital she'd arrived at 8 months ago with a duffel bag and a desire for something quieter. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Donna Briggs. They're taking Kane's office files. All of them. I just watched them carry out 3 boxes. Emily read it, forwarded it to Okafor, kept walking toward her car. She was 20 feet from the vehicle when she heard someone call her name. Not from behind, from the side, from the direction of the ambulance bay. She turned. It was Webb. Marcus Webb, the second-year resident who'd been about to push the epinephrine 2 nights ago, who'd stood back and watched Emily work, who'd filed the medication log that became part of the federal record. He was in his scrubs, coat too thin for the temperature, and he was looking at her with the expression of someone who had spent 48 hours sitting with something they needed to say. He crossed the parking lot toward her and stopped a few feet away. He looked younger outside the hospital, without the frame of the bay and the equipment. He also looked like he hadn't slept. I gave a statement this morning, he said, to the federal investigators. Okay, Emily said. I told them what I saw, exactly what I saw. He swallowed. I told them you were right, about the presentation, about the medication, about all of it. He paused. I also told them that I was going to push the epi, that if you hadn't been there, I would have. Emily looked at him. He was confessing something that had cost him. She could see that. Not legally, not yet, but in the private accounting of what he'd almost done and what it meant. You didn't know, she said. I should have seen it. Maybe, Emily said. Or maybe you hadn't seen that presentation before and you were working from your training. That's what training is for. She paused. The problem isn't that you almost made a mistake. The problem is that the person who should have been there to catch it was in the physician's lounge. Webb nodded. He was holding something else back. She could read it. Say it, she said. I knew about Kane, Webb said. Not about that night specifically, but I'd heard things from other residents. Cases where he'd been slow. Cases where the response times were... He stopped. I never filed anything. I didn't think it was my place. Emily held that. It wasn't an easy thing to hold. The knowledge that the system had been sending signals and people had received them and calculated that speaking up wasn't survivable. She'd been on the other side of that calculation herself, 8 months of biting her tongue. You're filing something now, she said. Yeah, Webb said quietly. I am. She nodded, started toward her car again, then stopped. Webb, she said. He looked up. You held back the epinephrine when I told you to, even though you had no reason to trust me. She met his eyes. That took something. She got in her car, started it, pulled out of the parking lot onto the street, and she was 2 blocks away before she noticed that her hands weren't entirely steady on the wheel. Not from fear, but from the particular delayed physiological response to sustained high stakes, the body's way of processing what the mind had kept on hold. She pulled over on a side street and sat for a moment with the engine running. Quiet. The heater making its noise. A dog walking a man past the window in the unhurried way of a Saturday morning, even though it was a Thursday. 18 months of records. 3 boxes from Kane's office. A board of directors in emergency session. A Department of Justice request that had arrived so fast the hospital's attorneys were still processing it. And tomorrow morning, a meeting with someone from the White House Medical Unit about what came next. For her. She sat with all of it, let it breathe. Then she put the car in drive and headed home because there was nothing she could do tonight that couldn't be done better after sleep. And for the first time in 2 days, She thought she might actually get some. She was 3 minutes from her apartment when her phone rang through the car speaker. Okafor, whose name she recognized before the ring finished. "Patricia," she said. "I just got off the phone with Rourke." Okafor's voice had the quality of someone delivering news they were still parsing themselves. "The 18-month review found something they didn't expect." Emily kept driving. "Tell me." "There are 3 other patients," Okafor said. 3 other critical pages in the last 14 months, where Kane's badge scan puts him somewhere other than a patient bay. 3 other cases where the response gap is significant. A pause. 2 of those patients recovered. 1 didn't. The words landed in the car's warm air and stayed there. "1 didn't," Emily repeated. "A 67-year-old man, 8 months ago. Documented cardiac event, page acknowledged, 11-minute gap in response, patient coded during the gap." Okafor's voice was controlled and careful. "The death was internally classified as a natural cardiac event. No investigation, no external review." Emily pulled into her apartment building's parking lot and stopped the car. "That was 1 month before I started at Bay Hollows," she said. "Yes," Okafor said. "It was." The parking lot lamp buzzed above her car. The dry cleaner next door was dark, closed for the evening. The same window she looked at every night. The same quiet street. "They knew," Emily said. Not a question. "Someone knew," Okafor said carefully. "The investigators are working to establish who and when, but Emily—" She stopped. "Say it," Emily said, which was the second time she'd said that today. "If this holds," Okafor said, "if the documentation supports what they're currently seeing, this isn't a story about one bad night and an administrator protecting his chief of cardiology anymore." A beat. "This is a story about a hospital that covered up a preventable death, and Kane and everyone who helped manage that cover-up is looking at something far worse than a federal complaint." Emily sat in her car in the parking lot and stared through the windshield at the brick wall of her apartment building. 2nd floor. The window of her kitchen was lit. She'd left the light on when she left this morning, which she almost never did. The small, ordinary evidence of a morning that had started one way and was ending entirely differently. "Patricia," she said. "Yes." "Is the family of that patient, the one 8 months ago, do they know?" A long pause. "Not yet," Okafor said, "but they will." Emily closed her eyes for just a second. Then she opened them because there was nothing in the dark that was going to help her with what was in the light. "Okay," she said. "I'll see you tomorrow." She ended the call and sat in the quiet for exactly 30 seconds, which was all the time she allowed herself. Then she got out of the car, locked it, and walked up the stairs to her apartment. And behind her in the hospital across the city, 3 boxes of files were being cataloged, and a family that didn't yet know their father's death had a different explanation than the one they'd been given, was going to receive the call that would rearrange everything they thought they understood about the worst day of their lives. She didn't sleep until after 2. Not from anxiety exactly. The adrenaline that had been running her system for 48 hours had finally metabolized into something closer to exhaustion, which should have made sleep easy. But her mind kept returning to the family. The 67-year-old man who'd died 8 months ago, 1 month before she'd walked through Bay Hollow's front door. A family that had buried someone and been handed an explanation that fit neatly into the category of things that happen to older men with cardiac histories. And they'd taken that explanation because what else do you do when a hospital tells you there was nothing anyone could have done? She lay in the dark and thought about that family sitting with their grief for 8 months. The particular terrible comfort of believing it was nobody's fault. And now someone was going to call them and explain that the comfort was built on something that wasn't true. She didn't know their names. She didn't know anything about them except that they existed and that what was coming toward them was going to be brutal in a different way than the original loss, because the original loss had been final, and this was going to reopen everything. There was nothing Emily could do about that. It was outside her sector, but she lay with it anyway, because it deserved to be lain with, and at some point after 2 a.m., she fell asleep with the light still on in the kitchen. The morning meeting was at a hotel 3 blocks from the hospital, a mid-tier chain business hotel the kind with a conference room on the second floor that could be reserved without the foot traffic and visibility of a federal building. Colonel Whitfield was already there when Emily arrived at 8:30 with Okafor. So was a woman Emily hadn't met yet, Dr. Sandra Voss, director of the Federal Emergency Medical Response Program, which was a division of DHS that Emily had a general awareness of but no specific knowledge about. Voss was somewhere in her early 50s, compact and direct, with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and the manner of someone who had spent decades making decisions that mattered and had stopped wasting time on the ones that didn't. She shook Emily's hand, looked at her for a moment with the focused appraisal of someone doing a rapid professional assessment, and said, "Sit down. I'll make this straightforward." Emily sat. She appreciated straightforward. "You have a skill set that is currently being used below its capacity," Voss said. "That's not an editorial statement. It's an observation based on your service record, which I've reviewed in full, and the events of the last 48 hours, which I've reviewed more recently." She set a folder on the table but didn't open it. The Federal Emergency Medical Response Program runs 4 regional rapid deployment units. Their function is to provide medical support in situations that require both clinical expertise and operational experience, mass casualty events, federal protective operations, disaster response. The people in those units need to be able to function in environments that civilian medicine doesn't train for. "I know what FEMRP does," Emily said. Voss allowed a small, precise acknowledgement of that. "Then you understand why we're having this conversation." She finally opened the folder. "We have a vacancy at the regional coordinator level. It's not a frontline position. It's supervisory, which means you'd be managing a team as well as deploying with them. Your clinical background fits. Your military background fits." She paused. "Your recent history of functioning under institutional pressure while maintaining correct clinical judgment fits." Okafor, beside Emily, had gone very still in the way she did when she was listening to something significant without wanting to influence the room. "There are conditions," Voss continued. "It requires a security clearance update, which, given your existing clearances, should be a 30-day process. It requires a 6-week orientation at the program's facility in Virginia. And it requires you to be willing to relocate, with the understanding that your deployment zone will primarily be the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic regions." She set the folder down. "It's a GS-13 position. I won't negotiate salary in this room, but you can look up the pay scale." Emily looked at her steadily. "You're offering me this because of what happened 2 nights ago." "I'm offering you this," Voss said, "because of what happened 2 nights ago, and every decision you made in the 6 years before that. The 2 nights ago is the reason I'm moving fast." She leaned back slightly. "You're sitting in Fairmont, Ohio, working night shifts for reasons that have more to do with exhaustion than ambition. I don't say that as a judgment. I say it because the skill set you're using at a fraction of its capacity is a skill set my program needs." Emily didn't answer immediately. She looked at the folder. The window. The particular kind of winter morning that had settled over Fairmont for the last 2 days. Gray and cold and flat, the sky the color of an institutional floor. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "You have 72 hours, Voss said. "After that, the operational window for this cycle closes." It wasn't a pressure tactic. It was a logistical reality, and Voss said it the same way she'd said everything else, matter-of-factly, without decoration. Emily respected that. 72 hours, Emily said. They shook hands again, and the meeting was over in 23 minutes, which was longer than the meeting with the president's father and shorter than any of Emily's federal depositions, and it was the one that sat with her longest on the drive back. Kane's attorney issued a public statement at 11 a.m. Emily heard about it from Okafor, who texted a link to the statement alongside a single-word assessment, predictable. The statement characterized Kane as a dedicated physician of 30 years whose clinical decisions were being reviewed out of context by investigators unfamiliar with the operational realities of a busy urban hospital. It expressed full confidence in the ultimate findings of any fair review. It used the word politicized twice. Okafor called 20 minutes after the text. "His attorney is good," she said, without admiration exactly. The statement is designed to start building the narrative that whatever the investigators find was shaped by the political circumstances around the patient's identity. It's preemptive positioning. Does it hold? Emily asked. Against electronic timestamp logs and badge scan data? No. But it doesn't need to hold. It needs to muddy the water enough that Kane can negotiate down from criminal charges to professional sanctions. A pause. The question is whether the DOJ is interested in negotiating. And the other patient, the one who died? That, Okafor said with the deliberate precision of someone selecting the right weight of words, is a different conversation. Criminal negligence in a medical context is difficult to prosecute, but if they can establish that Kane was aware of the pattern and the hospital covered it administratively, that moves toward obstruction and potentially involuntary manslaughter, depending on how aggressive the DOJ wants to be. She paused again. Tharp is already talking. His attorney called the DOJ this morning, which means he's decided that cooperating early is better than going down with Kane. Emily processed that. Tharp was cutting Kane loose. Whatever coordination had happened between them in the early hours of Tuesday morning, Tharp had decided that the phone records and the document seizure made loyalty too expensive. What about the nursing board? Emily asked. All proceedings against you have been formally suspended pending the federal investigation's completion. The board chair issued a statement this morning, brief, careful, no admission of anything, saying that the board takes seriously any information suggesting its processes were improperly influenced. Okafor's voice had a dry edge. In other words, they know what happened, and they're creating as much distance from Kane as the timeline allows. Emily was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she was on the phone. Outside, the parking lot of the dry cleaner was getting its morning traffic. 2 cars, a woman with a plastic-wrapped dress over her arm, the ordinary movement of a day that had no idea it was adjacent to something this large. Patricia, Emily said. The family. The one from 8 months ago. Do they know yet? A breath. DOJ contacted them last night. A victim advocate went with the investigator. A pause that was not lawyerly. That was just human. I don't have details on how it went. No, Emily said. You wouldn't. She went to the hospital that afternoon not because she was required to, but because Donna Briggs had texted asking if she was coming by. And Donna had texted her at 4 a.m. with information that cost something to send. And Emily wasn't the kind of person who let debts like that sit uncollected. Bay Hollows looked different. Not physically, same brick, same sign, same ambulance bay, but atmospherically. The way a place feels when the people inside it are processing something they can't talk about openly. The lobby staff were quieter than usual. The normal mid-afternoon rhythm was present but subdued, like music played at slightly reduced volume. The federal investigation team had moved out of the third-floor conference room and into the administrative wing, which meant they'd finished with the clinical documentation and were now into the organizational structure. The implications of that move were not subtle. Donna found Emily in the corridor outside the cardiac unit and steered her toward the break room with the directness of someone who had limited time and no interest in wasting it. They interviewed me for 3 hours this morning, Donna said, filling 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the corner. She handed one to Emily without asking. Me and 6 other nurses from the floor. They wanted everything. Every time we'd flagged a late response, every time we'd documented a concern and had it go nowhere, every informal complaint that got filed and then quietly disappeared. How much was there? Emily asked. Donna looked at her with the expression of someone who'd been carrying a weight for a long time and was only now setting it down in front of someone who could understand its actual heaviness. More than I would have said out loud a week ago, she said. Not because I was hiding it, because you tell yourself it's the system. It's everywhere. You manage around it. You do what you can. You don't add it up. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. When I added it up for the investigators this morning, I sat there and listened to myself talk, and I thought, we should have done this a long time ago. You couldn't have known it would end up here, Emily said. No, Donna said, but someone died. She said it flatly, without theater. And we managed around it, and we told ourselves we didn't know for certain, and here we are. Emily drank her coffee. It was better than the vending machine version she'd had on Monday, which felt like a different era. The staff, Emily said. How are they handling it? Depends who you ask. Donna set her cup down. The senior attendings are scared. Not for Kane. They've already figured out which way that goes. Scared for themselves, whether their own documentation is going to hold up. The residents and junior nurses are, she considered, relieved, I think. Is that the right word? Like something they'd been navigating without having a name for it just got named. Emily thought about Webb in the parking lot. I knew about Kane. I'd heard things. The distributed awareness that exists in any institution where something is wrong, everyone holding a piece of it, nobody holding enough to act on, each person making the individual calculation that speaking wasn't survivable. What about you? Emily asked. Donna looked at her directly. I'm 61 years old and I've worked this floor for 19 years, she said. I'm fine. I told the truth this morning and I'll tell it again tomorrow if they need me to. She picked up her cup again. What I want to know is what happens to you. Emily told her about the FEMRP offer. Not all of it. The security clearance details weren't hers to share, but the shape of it. Donna listened, and her expression over the rim of her coffee cup was not the reaction Emily expected, which would have been enthusiasm or encouragement. Instead, it was something quieter. You should take it, Donna said. I haven't decided yet. I know you haven't, but you should. She set the cup down again, final this time. This place, the right version of this place, after all this shakes out, doesn't need you anymore. Not the way that program does. She looked at Emily steadily. You stayed small here. You tried to fit. It didn't work because you're not built to fit in places like this. A pause, not unkind. That's not an insult. I know, Emily said. Meant. She was crossing the lobby on her way out when Gerald Tharp came through the administrative corridor with his private attorney, a man Emily didn't recognize, in a suit that cost more than Tharp's, and the two of them stopped when they saw her. Tharp's attorney moved slightly forward, which was a reflex rather than a useful maneuver, and Tharp put a hand on his arm to stop him. For a moment, Tharp and Emily just looked at each other across the lobby's public space with its ambient noise and movement, the two of them standing in it like a pause someone had inserted into the scene. Tharp was a man who had built a career on institutional management, on understanding which way things were going and positioning himself correctly. He had spent 48 hours understanding which way this was going, and it showed, not in his posture, which was still professionally assembled, but in the area around his eyes, which had the look of someone who hadn't slept and had spent his waking hours in conversations he hadn't expected to be having. He walked toward her. His attorney said something low and urgent, and Tharp ignored it. He stopped 3 feet away. Close enough for a conversation, but not close enough for it to look like one. I want you to know, he said, keeping his voice under the ambient noise, that the decision to file the board complaint was not mine. I was advised. Mr. Tharp, Emily said. He stopped. I'm not the person you should be explaining that to, she said. And I'm not the person it's going to matter to. She held his gaze. Save it for the investigators. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, a single, short motion, and walked back to his attorney, and they continued toward the exit without looking back. Emily watched them go. She didn't feel the satisfaction she might have expected. What she felt was closer to something else, a kind of flat recognition that the machine was working now, grinding through the material it had been given, and the people in its path were learning that the institutional protections they'd trusted were not, in fact, protection. She pushed through the main door and walked to her car. The DOJ's formal announcement came at 4:17 p.m., and it moved faster than Emily had expected given the typical pace of federal communications, which told her someone had made a deliberate decision to move publicly before the evening news cycle. She was in her apartment when Okafor called. Dr. Victor Kane has been placed on administrative suspension by the Ohio State Medical Board pending criminal investigation, Okafor said, and the precision of her voice couldn't entirely contain what was underneath it. The Department of Justice has confirmed an active criminal investigation into potential criminal negligence and obstruction of administrative proceedings. Gerald Tharp has been placed on administrative leave by Bay Hollow's Board of Directors, which held an emergency session this afternoon and has also announced an independent external review of all patient safety incidents over the last 24 months. Emily sat on her couch and listened. The hospital's board issued a public statement acknowledging that the internal investigation process following certain patient outcomes was, I'm reading directly, inadequate and potentially compromised by conflicts of interest within the administrative structure. They have announced the appointment of an interim administrator pending a full leadership review. Okafor paused. They also, and this is new as of 1 hour ago, issued a formal public apology to you, by name, posted on the hospital website and released to local media. Emily looked at the wall across from her couch. Still nothing on it. She'd been in this apartment 7 months. The apology acknowledges that the disciplinary actions taken against you were initiated improperly, that your clinical decision was correct and appropriate, and that the hospital deeply regrets the impact on your professional standing. Okafor's voice was careful now, measuring each piece. It's a real apology, Emily. Someone on that board's legal team wrote it knowing the DOJ was reading it. What about the family? Emily said. The Mercer family, the one from 8 months ago? Their name is Alderman. Thomas Alderman was 71. His wife and his daughter were contacted last night. Okafor was quiet for a moment. The daughter issued a statement to local media this afternoon. She said they want to see a full criminal accounting, and she's retained an attorney for a civil suit against the hospital. Emily absorbed that. Thomas Alderman, 71 years old, a name that had existed in the record as a case file for 8 months, that was now a name with a family attached to it who were reading their father's death differently than they'd read it yesterday. The nursing board, Emily said, all proceedings against you have been formally dropped. Not suspended, dropped. The board issued a statement distancing itself from the Kane filing and has opened an investigation into whether its own emergency processing protocols were improperly invoked. A beat. In plain terms, they're investigating the board chair. Busy day, Emily said. It's not done, Okafor said. The state medical examiner's office has been asked to review Thomas Alderman's case. If they reclassify the cause of death, which early indications suggest is likely, the criminal negligence case against Kane becomes significantly stronger. Emily was quiet. Emily, Okafor said, with a shift in register that moved from lawyerly to something more direct. I've been in practice for 17 years. I've seen institutions under federal scrutiny manage their way through it and come out mostly intact. What I'm watching right now is different. The DOJ doesn't announce criminal investigations publicly this fast unless they've already built the file. They're not fishing, they have what they need. A pause. Kane is not going to negotiate his way to a professional sanction. He's looking at charges. Emily stood and went to the window. The parking lot, the dry cleaner, the same view she'd been looking at for 7 months. Patricia, she said, thank you for all of it. That's what you're paying me for, Okafor said, which was not entirely true, and both of them knew it. She called her brother Danny at 6. He'd seen the news. Local Fairmont coverage had picked up the DOJ announcement, and the wire services had picked it up from there. And at some point in the last 2 hours, it had become a national story. Not the biggest story of the day, but real. Hospital administrator placed on leave, doctor under criminal investigation, federal involvement in a mid-sized Ohio hospital. It had the particular shape of a story that the news cycle found legible. What the news coverage didn't have was Emily's name. The DOJ and the White House Medical Unit had kept her identity out of the public statements, which was, she understood, a courtesy and a protection, giving her the choice of how and whether to step into the public dimension of this. Danny knew anyway. Mom called me, he said. She saw the hospital name and called me. I had to tell her. How'd she take it? She cried, Danny said. Not the bad kind. The kind where she's scared it could have gone worse. A pause. She wants to talk to you. I'll call her tonight. You doing okay? Emily considered the question, which was more complex than Danny probably meant it to be. She was functional. She was clear-headed. She had a 72-hour window to decide whether to leave the state for a federal position that fit her better than anything she'd had in 3 years. And she had a public apology from an institution that had tried to end her career 96 hours ago, and somewhere across Fairmont, investigators were building a criminal case against a man who had decided she was disposable. "Yeah," she said. "I'm okay." "Good," Danny said. "Come for Mom's birthday. Whatever's happening, you need to eat her pasta." She laughed at that. A real one, short and unperformed, the kind that surprised her. "I will," she said. The next morning's news cycle brought something she hadn't anticipated. Donna texted at 7:15. "Turn on Channel 4. Emily turned on Channel 4. A Fairmont local news anchor was doing a live report from the Bay Hollows parking lot. She could see the main entrance behind him, the same entrance she'd walked through hundreds of times. And beside him was a woman in her 40s with the particular composed devastation of someone who had decided that composure was the only container large enough for what she was carrying. The Chiron identified her as Rachel Alderman Pierce, daughter of Thomas Alderman. "My father went to that hospital," she was saying, her voice steady and deliberate, "because he trusted it. He was a good man who worked his whole life and took care of his family, and he deserved better than what he got. And my family deserved the truth. We didn't get it for 8 months, and I want every family who has ever walked into that hospital to know that we are going to make sure this is fully accounted for." The reporter asked something. "I'm told," Rachel Alderman Pierce said, and she looked directly into the camera, "that there was a nurse who saw the truth 2 nights ago and didn't back down. I don't know her name, but I want her to know that my family thanks her, because if she hadn't done what she did, we might never have known what really happened to our father." Emily sat on her couch with her phone in her hand and watched the woman on the screen and felt something that didn't have a clean name. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but something in the territory of both and beyond either. The particular feeling of a thing that was broken, being slowly, imperfectly, with significant collateral damage made less broken. Her phone rang. Okafor. "I saw it," Emily said before Okafor could speak. "The hospital's insurance carrier has already made preliminary contact with the Alderman family's attorney," Okafor said. "The civil suit hasn't been filed yet, but the carrier isn't waiting." A brief pause. "Also, Mom, Kane's attorney issued a second statement this morning, much shorter than yesterday's." "What does it say?" "The Dr. Kane is cooperating fully with investigators and has no further public comment at this time." Okafor let that sit for a beat. "That's attorney language for, the first statement didn't work and we're changing strategy." "He's going to plead," Emily said. "Almost certainly. The question is what he pleads to and what he gives them in exchange." A pause. "He may have information about the administrative cover-up that goes higher than THARP. If he does, he'll use it." Emily thought about that. The layers of institutional self-protection, the way cover-ups weren't usually one person making one decision, but a series of small decisions made by multiple people, each one a little wrong, each one building on the last until the aggregate was something none of the individual participants would have signed up for at the beginning. "Patricia," Emily said, "I made a decision." A brief silence. Then, "The FEMRP offer." "Yes." "And?" Emily looked at the wall across from her couch. Still nothing on it. 7 months and nothing on it because she'd been living here the way you live, somewhere you're not sure you're staying, holding the space provisional, keeping the footprint light. "I'm taking it," she said. Okafor exhaled. Not dramatically, just the small controlled release of tension that even a disciplined person sometimes lets through. "Good," she said. "That's the right call." "I know. I'll contact Voss's office today and confirm your decision. The clearance process..." "Patricia," Emily kept her voice level, "I need you to do something else first. Tell me." "The Alderman family," Emily said. "Rachel Alderman Pierce. I want her to have my contact information, not through the media, not officially, through you, directly, so she knows it's real." She paused. "She said she wanted to thank me. I'd rather talk to her." A silence on the other end, then, "I'll make that happen. Thank you." She ended the call and sat with the quiet of the apartment. The television was still on. The Fairmont local news had moved to a different story, something about a road closure on the interstate. The ordinary machinery of the day. Her phone buzzed. A text from a Washington area code she didn't recognize. Ms. Carter, this is Captain Toll. The President's father is being discharged tomorrow. He has asked if you would be willing to meet with him briefly before his transport. Informal, no press. His request, not ours. No obligation. Emily read it twice, thought about the sharp eyes of the man in the hospital bed, who'd asked her where she'd deployed and had listened to the answer like it was a data point he was indexing. She typed back, "Yes. Tell me the time." The response came in under a minute. 0900, room 214. Thank you. She put the phone down. Outside, Fairmont was doing its mid-morning things. Traffic on the street, someone's car alarm going off briefly and then stopping, a dog barking twice and then not again. The unchanged, unchangeable texture of ordinary life running alongside extraordinary events without knowing it. Her kitchen light was still on. She got up, walked across the apartment, and turned it off. Then she stood in the slightly dimmer room and looked at the bare wall and thought about what Donna had said. You stayed small here. You tried to fit. She went to the front closet and found the box she'd moved in with and never opened. The box that had prints and photographs in it. Things she'd pulled off the walls of her last apartment when she'd left and folded carefully into cardboard because she wasn't ready to put them up somewhere new. Wasn't sure anywhere new was permanent enough to warrant the 2 hours in the nail holes. She opened the box. The prints were still wrapped in tissue. She set them on the counter. She had somewhere to be at 9 a.m. tomorrow. She had 72 hours to confirm a federal offer that would take her to Virginia in 6 weeks. She had a family to call back, a lawyer to coordinate, a formal process to navigate, and at the end of all of it, an entirely different chapter of her life waiting to start. She unwrapped the first print and leaned it against the kitchen wall to look at it. Then she went to find the hammer. She was hanging the second print when her phone buzzed with a news alert, national now, picked up by the wire services, with a headline that read, Federal Criminal Investigation Opens into Ohio Hospital. Following death of President's father's attending physician to miss critical pages, nurse at center of incident cleared of all charges. The headline was imprecise in several ways that would probably be corrected in later versions. But the core of it was right, and she read it once and set her phone face down on the counter and went back to hanging the print. The hammer, the nail, the small, sharp sound of it going into the wall. She stepped back to check the level, and it was slightly off, which she adjusted, and then it was right, and she moved to the next one. She was reaching for the third print when her phone buzzed again. Not a news alert this time, a call, incoming, from a number she didn't recognize but with an Ohio area code she didn't place immediately. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her pick up. Ms. Carter? A woman's voice, carefully composed, but only just. My name is Rachel Alderman Pierce. Your attorney gave me your number. A breath. I hope it's all right that I'm calling. It's all right, Emily said. I'm glad you did. A silence that was not empty. It was full of the particular weight of what Rachel Alderman Pierce had been carrying, and the particular strangeness of being on the phone with the person whose actions had forced that weight into the open. I don't, Rachel started, stopped, started again. I don't know exactly what to say. I've been thinking about what I would say, and now I'm on the phone and I don't have it. You don't have to say anything specific, Emily said. My father was a quiet man, Rachel said. He was a retired postal worker. He grew tomatoes in the backyard and he watched too much baseball and he called me every Sunday. She stopped. When he died, they told us it was his heart, that he'd been in decline, that these things happen. Another stop, longer. I believe them. We all believe them. You go through the grief and the funeral and all of it, and you put it in the category of things that happen because what else do you do? Emily stood in her kitchen with a print still in her hand and listened. My mother is 83, Rachel said. She's going to have to understand that her husband's death wasn't... She didn't finish the sentence. I'm angry. I want you to know that. I'm very angry. You should be, Emily said. But I also, Rachel's voice caught and steadied. I also know that you didn't know about my father when you made the decision you made. You were just trying to save a man whose name you didn't know. And because of that, what happened to my father is going to be, someone is going to be held accountable. She paused. I needed to say thank you, even though there isn't a version of thank you that covers it. No, Emily said quietly. There isn't. Is that enough? Saying it anyway? Emily thought about that. Yes, she said. It is. The call lasted another 4 minutes. By the end, Rachel Alderman Pierce was crying, not loudly, but openly, in the way that happens when the controlled composure of a public statement gives way to the unmanaged reality underneath it. Emily stayed on the line and didn't try to fill the space with anything useful, because there was nothing useful in that space, and the kindest thing she knew how to do was just to be present in it. After the call ended, she stood in the kitchen for a moment, the prints leaning against the wall, the hammer on the counter, the late morning light coming through the window at the angle it came through at this time of year, which she'd learned over 7 months without ever quite registering that she'd learned it. She set her phone face up this time. She picked up the hammer and the next print, and she kept going, and 3 hours later, when all of them were up and she stepped back to look at the wall, it looked like somewhere a person actually lived. And she stood there taking stock of that for a long moment before she noticed the new text on her phone from Okafor, which read, Preliminary DOJ briefing document leaked to AP. It's bigger than we thought. Call me when you see the news. Emily put down the hammer and picked up her phone and found the AP story, and she stood in her now decorated kitchen and read it. And halfway through the second paragraph, she stopped and read the sentence again, because it contained something she had not known and had not been told, and that changed the geometry of everything she'd understood about the last 4 days. The leaked briefing document wasn't just about Kane. It wasn't just about the Alderman case or the cover-up or the administrative coordination against Emily's license. The federal investigators, pulling 18 months of Bay Hollow's records, had found something in the financial documentation that had nothing to do with clinical negligence, a pattern of billing irregularities tied to specific case outcomes, suggesting that some of the delay in response times hadn't been purely about a physician's indifference or laziness, but about a financial structure that had quietly and systematically incentivized certain outcomes over others. The briefing document used the word fraud. Emily read that word 3 times, and then she called Okafor. And Okafor picked up before the second ring, and before Okafor could say anything, Emily said, How long have they known about the billing? Since yesterday morning, Okafor said. They didn't tell us because it's a separate investigation. Emily... She paused, and in the pause was something Emily couldn't read. Kane didn't build this alone. The billing irregularities go through 3 administrative layers. Tharp is implicated directly, but there are signatures above Tharp. Above Tharp, Emily said. The board. At least 2 members, Okafor said. Possibly more. The DOJ isn't confirming names yet, but the APP suggests they have documentation tying specific board-level approvals to the financial structure. Emily sat down on the kitchen chair, the chair she'd been eating at alone for 7 months, the chair that was now the center of a kitchen that looked like somewhere a person lived, and she held the phone and felt the full scope of what she was standing inside. She'd walked into Bay Hollows 8 months ago, and she'd seen a flawed place doing flawed medicine, and she'd tried to navigate it with enough grace and enough compromise to build something functional. And underneath the surface of that place, running through its institutional bones, was something that had nothing to do with the normal flaws of a normal institution. Something deliberate. Something that had weighed human outcomes against financial returns and made choices. And the person who'd cracked it open was a nurse who'd been fired for saving a life. Emily, Okafor said, Are you there? I'm here, she said. There's going to be media contact. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. Reporters are going to find your name. The apology statement named you, and reporters have search engines. A pause. You need to decide how you want to handle that. Emily looked at the wall, the print she'd just hung, the particular effort of finally putting something permanent in a space she'd been treating as temporary. I'll issue a statement, she said. Short. Through you. What do you want it to say? Emily thought about Rachel Alderman Pierce on the phone crying, about Thomas Alderman growing tomatoes and watching baseball and getting a Sunday call from his daughter, about Donna Briggs saying we should have done this a long time ago, about the 30 seconds in a trauma bay when a man's life sat on the edge of a single decision. Tell them, Emily said, that I did what I was trained to do, that I'd do it again, and that I hope what comes from this makes it harder for this to happen to the next family. A pause. That's good, Okafor said, and tell them I'm not doing interviews. Also good, Okafor said. I'll handle the rest. She got off the phone and sat in the quiet kitchen and didn't look at the news for the next 2 hours, because she'd read enough to know the machine was working now, and the work didn't require her to watch it happen in real time. At 4 p.m., she texted Captain Toll to confirm the 9 a.m. meeting with Robert Harper. At 4:15, she texted Sandra Voss's office to formally accept the FEMRP position. At 4:30, she called her mother, and they talked for 50 minutes, which was longer than their normal calls. And most of what was said had nothing to do with hospitals or federal investigations or any of the events of the last 4 days. They talked about her brother Danny's new apartment and whether the pasta recipe needed more salt and what the weather was like in Fairmont and whether Emily was eating enough, which she was, mostly. When she got off the call, the light in the kitchen had shifted to the afternoon amber that came through at this hour, and it caught the frames of the prints on the wall and made the room look different than it had this morning. Warmer, more inhabited, more like somewhere a person had chosen to be, rather than somewhere they'd landed. She sat with that for a moment. Then her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that made her go completely still when she read it, because it was from a Bay Hollows email address she didn't recognize, and it said 6 words that didn't make immediate sense. There is a 5th patient. Call me. She stared at the text for 10 seconds. Then she called Okafor. Unknown sender, Bay Hollows email domain, Emily said the moment Okafor picked up. 6 words. There is a 5th patient. Call me. Okafor was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Don't call back yet. Forward it to me first. Then sit tight. Emily forwarded it, sat tight for 4 minutes, which was harder than sitting tight usually was, because the sentence had weight, and she could feel it. 4 patients had become the understood scope of the investigation. 3 survivors, 1 death. A number with dimensions already. Criminal dimensions, civil dimensions. A family on television whose grief had been reframed overnight. A 5th patient meant the scope wasn't what anyone had thought, and scope in an active criminal investigation wasn't an abstract concept. It had consequences that branched. Okafor called back in 5 minutes. The email address belongs to a Dr. Nadia Flores. She's a hospitalist, internal medicine, been at Bay Hollows for about 3 years. Not directly tied to the cardiac unit, but she'd have access to broader patient records through the system. A pause. I've already texted Rourke. She wants you to hold off on contact until they've verified Flores in her access logs. If there's a 5th patient, I know, Okafor said. They know. Rourke's team is pulling Flores's file right now. A breath. Emily, you have a 9 a.m. meeting tomorrow. Go to sleep. Let the investigators do their job. She was right. Emily knew she was right. The investigation had machinery and personnel and legal authority that she didn't have, and inserting herself into it at 10 p.m. via an unverified text was not the move. Okay, Emily said. She put the phone down and looked at the prints on the wall. The room that finally looked like somewhere she lived. The hammer still on the counter. She got up and put the hammer away. Rourke called at 7:15 a.m., before Emily's alarm. Dr. Flores is legitimate, Rourke said, without preamble. She came to us last night after she sent you the text. She'd been sitting on information for 6 weeks. A patient from October, a 78-year-old woman named Gloria Marsh, cardiac event, page response gap of 14 minutes, survived but with permanent heart damage that her family was told was an inevitable consequence of her underlying condition. A pause. It wasn't. Flores documented her concerns internally 6 weeks ago. Her documentation was reviewed by Tharp's office and buried. Emily sat on the edge of her bed. The morning light was gray through the curtain. Flores was afraid to go external, Rourke continued. She'd watched what happened to you and made the individual calculation that speaking up wasn't survivable. Then she watched the last 4 days happen, and she changed her mind. Another pause. The DOJ is adding Gloria Marsh's case to the file. That gives them 5 documented incidents, 2 deaths if Alderman's case is reclassified, and a pattern that is now impossible to characterize as anything other than systemic. Is Flores protected? Emily asked. Federal whistleblower status, effective as of 11 p.m. last night. Rourke's voice had the particular careful quality of someone who wanted to say more than their role permitted. She's fine. She made the right call. Emily thought about Dr. Flores sitting on that information for 6 weeks. The weight of that. Knowing something and calculating that you were too small to carry it into the open. It wasn't cowardice. It was a rational response to institutional reality. And then watching someone else do the thing she'd been afraid to do, and deciding that the calculation had changed. That was how systems cracked. Not all at once. One person at a time, watching someone else hold the line first. Thank you for telling me, Emily said. Your 9 a.m. still stands, Rourke said. Room 214. Robert Harper was dressed when Emily arrived. Not in the hospital gown of 2 days ago, but in civilian clothes, the plain, practical clothes of a man who had spent years making himself unrecognizable. He was sitting in the chair beside the window, not in the bed, which was a statement about how he preferred to receive visitors. The IV line was gone. He looked like a man who had decided he was done being a patient. The room was otherwise empty. No federal agents, no White House medical unit staff, no attorneys. Whatever he'd arranged for this conversation, he'd arranged it to be private. Emily sat in the visitor's chair without being asked. She'd learned that he preferred directness to ceremony. You're leaving, he said. It wasn't a question. The FEMRP position. Yes. He nodded. Something in his expression suggested he'd already known, which probably meant Toll had told him, or Whitfield, or the dozen different communication channels that surrounded a man like this, even when he was actively trying to avoid them. Good posting, he said. Voss runs a tight operation. You know her? I know her work. He looked out the window at the courtyard. The bare trees, the winter grass, the concrete path. I spent a lot of years in intelligence. You learn to recognize people who function correctly under pressure. It's rarer than you'd think. He turned back to Emily. You function correctly under pressure. Most of the time, Emily said, because it was true. She'd had days in the field where she hadn't. She'd made decisions that cost her sleep afterward. The myth of the person who never cracked under pressure was exactly that. A myth that institutions told themselves to justify their faith in individuals rather than their systems. Robert Harper looked at her with the evaluative precision she'd first clocked in this room 2 days ago. I want to ask you something directly. You can tell me it's none of my business. Go ahead, Emily said. What made you stay? At Bay Hollows. 8 months of being managed and dismissed and navigated around. Most people with your background would have been gone in 4. Emily thought about how to answer that honestly. I was tired, she said. Not physically. The other kind. 6 years of operating at full capacity in conditions that were constant. I wanted something that required less of me. She paused. I thought I could be smaller, fit into a smaller space. And it turned out I couldn't, and the place I was trying to fit into was worse than I'd understood. She looked at him directly. I stayed because I needed the work, and because I'm not good at quitting. But I was wrong about what the place was. Harper nodded slowly. You're not the only one who was wrong about Bay Hollows, he said. My son's office made an assessment of that hospital 6 months ago for a federal partnership program. The assessment was favorable. He let that sit for a moment, and in the space it created, Emily could read what he wasn't saying, that the favorable assessment, if it had been accurate, might have caught what the institution was hiding before it cost Thomas Alderman his life. That wasn't your fault, Emily said. No, Harper said, but it's on the list of things I think about. He looked back at the window. I chose to disappear. I chose no security, no official presence, no way for anyone to know who I was if something went wrong. I made that choice because I valued my privacy over my safety, and I thought I was fit enough that the trade-off was reasonable. He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't wrong about my fitness. I was wrong about what could go wrong. Emily didn't offer him absolution for that because he wasn't asking for it, and it wasn't hers to give. He was just saying the thing out loud, which sometimes was the only thing you could do with it. Gloria Marsh, Emily said. He looked at her. I heard this morning. She's 78, and she has permanent damage that she was told was inevitable. Emily held his gaze. It wasn't, and she's been living with a diminished heart for 4 months, thinking it was just what happened. I know. 5 patients, Emily said. 2 dead or 1 dead and 1 with life-altering damage and 3 more who don't know how close they came, and a billing structure that made the delay profitable. She paused, not because she was unsure of what she was saying, but because she wanted him to feel the full weight of it. That's what was operating in there while the administrative assessment said favorable. Harper was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular flatness of someone who had processed something and was presenting the result without the processing visible. What do you want me to do with that? Nothing specific, Emily said. I just needed to say it to someone who has the standing to make sure it doesn't get managed back down to a hospital governance problem. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, It won't. She believed him, not because he was who he was, but because of the way he said it, without the weight of performance. Just a statement from a man who knew how to make things happen and had decided that this was one of the things that needed to happen. She stood. He stood. They shook hands, and it was briefer than the president's handshake 2 days ago, and carried more weight, because it was between 2 people who had just had an honest conversation rather than an official one. Take the Virginia posting seriously, he said. Don't make yourself small again. I won't, Emily said, and meant it. The sentencing phase, when it came, was faster than Emily's attorney had predicted. Victor Kane, facing charges of criminal negligence and obstruction of an administrative proceeding, entered a guilty plea 11 weeks after the night in Trauma Bay 3. The plea was negotiated but not light. Permanent revocation of his medical license in all 50 states, 5 years probation, and a formal civil settlement with the families of Thomas Alderman and Gloria Marsh that his attorneys negotiated privately, but that local reporting indicated was significant. The criminal negligence charge in connection with Alderman's death was the one that held, reclassified by the state medical examiner 4 weeks after the investigation began. Kane's attorney issued a statement describing his client's remorse. Kane himself said nothing publicly, which was its own kind of statement. Gerald Tharp was charged separately: obstruction, fraud, and 2 counts related to the billing irregularities that implicated him directly. He'd cooperated with investigators and received a reduced charge set for that cooperation. But reduced wasn't 0. He faced 18 months, loss of his administrator's license, and a civil suit from the hospital's own board, which had moved quickly to separate itself from the decisions made under his tenure. 2 board members resigned before charges were formally considered. The DOJ declined to prosecute them directly in exchange for full cooperation and testimony, which meant they kept their freedom and lost everything else: their positions, their professional reputations, their names in a public record that would follow them in ways that private settlement could not reach. The hospital's board chair, who had taken Kane's call at 1:45 a.m. and helped accelerate the nursing board proceedings, received a formal censure from the state bar and resigned from the board. The nursing board opened its own internal investigation and quietly replaced its chair 4 months after the events at Bay Hollows. None of it was clean. Institutions that had failed once had to rebuild, and rebuilding was a long, uneven process that didn't lend itself to the satisfying arc of justice served and lesson learned. Bay Hollows hired an interim administrator who brought in an external patient safety firm, overhauled its emergency response protocols, and began the slow work of being, if not a better institution, then at least a more honest one. Whether it held was a question that didn't have an answer yet. Emily heard updates from Okafor, and occasionally from Donna Briggs, who texted with the frequency of someone who'd decided that the relationship was worth maintaining. The updates were useful, but distant. She was in Virginia by the time the plea was entered, 3 weeks into her FEMRP orientation, learning the operational structure of the program she'd joined and the team she'd be leading, and Fairmont had receded to something she followed at a remove rather than lived inside. She was not, it turned out, sorry about that. Robert Harper called her on a Tuesday morning in March, 4 months after the night in Trauma Bay 3. She was at the FEMRP facility, between a training exercise and a briefing, and she stepped outside to take the call because the caller ID came through as a Washington area code she'd learned to recognize. Ms. Carter. Mr. Harper, she said. How are you? Better than October, he said, which was both true and a considerable understatement. His recovery had been full, which the White House Medical Unit had confirmed in a brief public statement that said exactly that and nothing more. I'm calling about something specific. My son is presenting a commendation next week. Federal level, exceptional service. He'd like you to attend. Emily stood outside the FEMRP facility in the March cold and looked at the parking lot and the tree line beyond it, Virginia winter still holding the branches bare. I'll be there, she said. Good, Harper said. Then, with the directness she'd come to understand was just how he operated. You doing all right? The new posting? Yes, she said. And then, because he'd been honest with her and she felt the same obligation in return, it's harder than Bay Hollows, requires more. I'm better. Good, he said again. And then, the Marsh family. Have you spoken with them? Twice, Emily said. Gloria Marsh is in cardiac rehabilitation. She called to tell me she'd run a quarter-mile on the treadmill. A brief silence. That's good news. She told me to tell you hello if I ever spoke to you again. Emily paused. She knows who you are. She put it together. I suspected she might. Another pause. What did she say? She said you have good taste in hospitals. Emily said it flat, which was the right delivery, and she heard something on the other end of the call that was as close as Robert Harper apparently got to laughter. Fair, he said. Dad. The commendation ceremony was in a room in a federal building in Washington that had the particular institutional gravity of rooms where things had been decided for a long time. Not grand, functional, carpeted, with rows of chairs and the kind of lighting that suggested official purpose without flourish. There were other recipients. Emily was not the only person in the room being recognized for something, which she found genuinely reassuring. The president spoke for 12 minutes. Emily had prepared herself for something formal and political and had been prepared to be fine with that. What she got instead was a man who had written his own remarks rather than having them written for him, which was visible in the way they didn't sound like a speech. They sounded like someone talking about something real. He talked about his father, about the choice Robert Harper had made to live outside the systems that most people his age and background lived inside, and the vulnerabilities that choice had created, and the night those vulnerabilities had intersected with a different kind of decision, the decision of a nurse who had looked at a situation and made the right call without permission and without reward and at personal cost. He talked about what that decision had unlocked, not just for his father, but for the families of 5 other patients who deserved to know the truth about what had happened to them. He talked about systems, about the institutional incentives that had allowed Bay Hollows to operate the way it did, and about the fact that the system had been cracked open not by federal oversight or hospital governance or any of the mechanisms that existed specifically to catch these failures, but by a single person in a trauma bay at 11:47 p.m. making a judgment call. There is a version of that night, he said, where Emily Carter waits for authorization, where she defers to the protocol and the hierarchy and the chain of command as she has been instructed to do, where my father dies and his death is filed in the same internal category as Thomas Alderman's death, and the institution that killed both of them continues to operate for another year, another 2 years, another 5, until enough accumulates that it becomes impossible to ignore. He paused. That version of that night is not a hypothetical. It is what would have happened. And the only reason it didn't happen is that Emily Carter is someone who understands the difference between following the rules and serving the purpose the rules were written for. Emily sat in her chair and listened and felt something move through her that was not pride exactly. Pride was too simple, too self-directed. It was something more like recognition. Not of herself specifically, but of the thing the president was describing. The gap between institutional procedure and actual purpose, and the weight of standing in that gap when you're the only one standing in it, when the cost is your career and your license and your name. She'd stood in that gap before. She would stand in it again. That was what the job was, any version of the job she'd ever done. He shook her hand. The same firm grip held a beat longer. "Because of your courage," he said, lower now, the public address voice set aside for something more direct. "My father is alive, and 5 families have the truth." He looked at her steadily. "That is not a small thing." "No," Emily said. "It isn't." She flew back to Virginia that night, coach seat, window, the lights of Washington visible through the glass as the plane banked north. She had the commendation in her bag, an actual physical object, framed, which she hadn't expected to be as affecting as it was, and which she would hang on the wall of her office when she got back, because she'd decided she was done leaving walls bare. She thought about the night in Trauma Bay 3, the 40 seconds, the monitor, the rash along the forearm, the resident with the epinephrine already drawn, the particular moment of decision when you have no authorization and no backup and no guarantee that what you're about to do will work, and you do it anyway because the alternative is watching someone die when you had the knowledge to prevent it. She thought about what that kind of decision costs in the short term: the suspension, the complaint, the public humiliation, the lawyer bills, the sleepless nights in an apartment with nothing on the walls. She thought about Thomas Alderman growing tomatoes and watching baseball, and the call his daughter made every Sunday, and the 8 months of grief built on a false foundation that had finally, painfully, been corrected. She thought about Gloria Marsh running a quarter-mile on a treadmill and calling to report it. She thought about Dr. Nadia Flores holding information for 6 weeks, and then watching someone hold the line and deciding the calculation had changed. About Webb in the parking lot saying, "I gave a statement this morning." About Donna Briggs texting at 4 a.m. because she'd decided that some debts were worth the risk of paying. She thought about all the people who had been navigating quietly around something wrong, each of them alone with their piece of it, each of them making the individual calculation that speaking wasn't survivable. And the way that changed, not because the institution changed, not because the rules changed, but because one person in a trauma bay made one decision that couldn't be managed into silence. That was the thing nobody told you about standing up. Not that it was easy, not that it would work out, not that the system would catch you. It might not. The outcome is never the reason. You do it because the alternative is complicity, and complicity has a weight that compounds over time until you can't remember what it was like to not carry it. Emily Carter had carried enough heavy things to know the difference. The plane leveled out above the cloud cover, and the lights of the cities below disappeared into gray, and she leaned her head against the window and let herself be still for a moment in the particular way that only works when you're suspended between two places and temporarily belong to neither. She had a team meeting at 8 a.m. She had a deployment exercise in 10 days, and a briefing next week, and an orientation evaluation at the end of the month. She had the beginning of something, not a quiet life, not a small space she was trying to fit herself into, but a job that asked everything she had and gave the work back at the same scale. She had fought for a stranger's life with 40 seconds and no permission, and everything that came from that, the exposure of a corrupt institution, the truth given back to 5 families, the careers ended and the licenses revoked and the legal machinery grinding through the evidence, all of it came from one decision made by someone who had been told, explicitly and institutionally, that her judgment didn't count. The irony of that was not lost on her. It never would be. There are places that will tell you you're too much, too confident, too independent, too certain of your own read on a situation. They'll dress it up in the language of protocol and chain of command and institutional knowledge, and underneath it will be the simple fear of someone who doesn't have the standing they think they do being outrun by someone who does. Don't make yourself small for those places. Don't file down your edges to fit a space that doesn't deserve them. The world has enough people who've learned to defer when deferring means the wrong thing happens. What it needs, what it has always needed, is people who know the difference between the rule and the reason for the rule, and who have the spine to stand in that gap when standing costs something. Emily Carter knew the difference. She always had.